Some true crime cases seem almost too outlandish to be true, since the details surrounding these cases can often be very strange. In some instances, people disappear and are never seen again, while in others, victims lose their lives under inexplicable circumstances, and the culprit is never identified, despite the dogged determination of the police to bring justice to the victims' family members, who are left to deal with their sudden absence. Number 10. Texarkana is a city that received its name thanks to the fact that it straddles the border between Texas and Arkansas. It's here that in the spring of 1946, an unknown attacker called the Texarkana Phantom committed a series of crimes that left the area in a state of fear. The first of these attacks came on the 22nd of February that year, when a couple, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry, were accosted while they were sitting in a car in Bowie County. They decided to pull over on a secluded road and could never have expected what happened next. They were approached by the unknown attacker and forced to get out of the car while under the threat of a firearm. They were unable to see the man's face since it was covered with a burlap sack, and he then proceeded to assault Jimmy by striking him with the weapon. He then assaulted Mary Jean before fleeing the scene on foot, and the attack could have been much worse were it not for the fact that a car was approaching. The police were notified, and thankfully both victims were able to recover, but only after suffering physical and mental trauma. This was the first of 4 attacks, and it would soon become clear just how lucky Jimmy and Mary Jean were to have escaped with their lives. 1 month after the initial attack, the police were contacted when the bodies of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were found on a different road in Bowie County. It was determined that they too had been attacked with a firearm, but this time their assailant made sure that they would not be able to relay any information as to what had happened. Whoever had carried out the crime ended their lives outside the car and then placed them back in the vehicle for reasons unknown. Then, on the 14th of April, Betty Jo Booker and Paul Martin, who were friends, were found deceased 3 miles from Spring Lake Park, where Paul's car had been parked. This time, the victims weren't found together, as Paul's body was discovered close to North Park Road, while Betty Jo was found under a tree about 5 hours later. But strangely, she was found with her right hand in one of her pockets, and it was never determined why this was done. The weapon used in this attack was found to be the same one that was used against the other victims, and it was now certain that the same man was responsible. The authorities asked that anyone with information come forward, and a reward was offered, but no tips were ever received. And this is when the attacker was given the moniker the Phantom Killer. On the 3rd of May that year, he carried out what's believed to be his final attack. At around 9 p.m., while Virgil was reading a newspaper, his life was ended when a man fired at him from outside a closed window. Upon realizing what had happened, Katie ran to the phone for help, but she was struck twice from the same position. The man then approached, but she managed to flee to a neighbor's house, and she was rushed to a nearby hospital, where she received treatment and managed to recover. A flashlight that had been dropped by the attacker was found beneath the window, but it contained no fingerprints. The reward for information was increased, but no one ever came forward with further information. No clues were ever found, and no other attacks were carried out. Hence, the identity of the Texarkana Phantom remains unknown. Number 9. It's been 24 years since a harrowing attack was carried out in the town of Florence, Montana, and to this day, the identity of the person responsible remains an unsolved mystery. The case started on the 6th of November, 2001, when a woman arrived at the Florence Hair Gallery salon. She'd made an appointment to have her hair done that morning, and as she was approaching the salon, she must have been in high spirits. But that all changed when she walked into the store. She noticed it was eerily quiet, and upon further investigation, discovered a woman lying on the floor deceased. She immediately ran out of the salon and contacted the police, who rushed to the scene. When they entered the premises, they discovered 2 more women deceased inside a storage room. It was quickly determined that there was no way of saving their lives, as they'd been attacked with a sharpened blade, and resuscitation would have been impossible. The first victim was identified as the owner of the salon, Dorothy Harris, who had arrived back at the building after running a few chores. The other 2 victims were manicurist Brenda Patch and Cynthia Paulus, who was in the middle of having a manicure done when the attack occurred. Bub Hoblet, Cynthia's son, would recall that on that morning, news of the attack spread quickly, and when he found out about it, he thought about how horrific the crime must have been, but would only later learn that his mother was one of the victims. He knew that she often visited the salon, but he also knew that she was not supposed to have an appointment that morning. Cynthia had changed her appointment to that morning at the last minute, and hence it's believed she was never an intended target. When business premises are attacked in this way, it's usually the case that the victims lose their lives during a botched robbery, but it was quickly determined that robbery was not the motive in this instance. No money was stolen from the register. All 3 women still had all of their jewelry on, and no valuable items were missing from the salon. Investigators were baffled by the attack, and it sent shockwaves through the community. Investigators would later recount the sense of fear that was palpable in the air in Florence in the weeks that followed, and before long they started receiving tips from the public. Investigators were sent to towns all over the country, but each time they hit a dead end. But it would only be several years later that 2 suspects were identified and named as Lincoln Benavides and Brian Weber. Benavides was known to traffic illegal substances, and it's believed that Weber was under his employ. It's now believed that one of the 3 women had gotten on Lincoln's bad side since she owed him a lot of money. The authorities believed the cash was supposed to be left in a certain spot for him to collect, and when it wasn't there when he arrived, Weber was sent in to end her life. Unfortunately, the other 2 victims were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they needlessly lost their lives. It was never proven that Benavides was responsible, and the charges against him were dropped, though he later was sent to prison on unrelated charges. This case remains under investigation to this day, and anyone who has additional information is urged to contact Detective Sergeant Matt Cashel at 406-375-4024. Number 8. Whenever anyone close to 25-year-old Michaela Hague is asked about her, they give the same response, that she was a lovely woman who'd fallen on hard times and had to resort to becoming a street worker. On the 5th of November, 2001, Michaela was walking along Bower Street in Sheffield, England, when she was approached by a man in a car. The 2 spoke for a brief moment before she got into her car, and they drove away. Later that same day, another street worker contacted the police to report that they'd found Michaela slumped over in a parking lot on the outskirts of the city center. When investigators arrived at the scene, she was between Kelham and Wicker, and they came upon a grisly sight. It was found that Michaela had been assaulted with a sharpened blade in a frenzied and prolonged attack. She had injuries to her neck and back, suggesting that her assailant had attacked her from behind. Quite unbelievably, despite the number of injuries to her body, which totaled 19, she was still barely alive, and she was able to speak to the responding officers. In a barely audible whisper, she stated that her attacker was a Caucasian, a clean-shaven male who was wearing a wedding ring. She added that he was about 38 years old and that he was wearing a blue fleece and glasses. The officer she spoke to with this information wrote it down on his hand, and it was later passed on to his fellow officers. After receiving initial treatment at the scene, she was taken to the Northern General Hospital, but was unable to fight any further, and she tragically passed away. A witness came forward to state that they'd seen a blue Ford Sierra driving away from the scene of the crime, but despite the best efforts of investigators, it was never found. Thanks to Michaela's description, the police were able to create an e-fit sketch of the attacker, and it was made available to the public, but no one ever came forward to identify him. While it's been suggested that Michaela's case went cold due to the fact that she was a street worker, investigators have thrown out these claims, stating that every lead that was received was followed up on, and that the same will be done with any new information that is found. The resulting investigation saw as many as 7,400 people interviewed, and before long it became the largest of its kind in the history of the South Yorkshire Police Service. Every owner of a blue Ford Sierra that could be found was questioned, but the attacker remained elusive. Other street workers in the area were also questioned in case they'd met a man similar in description in the past, but none had ever seen him before. The police also appealed to those who knew Michaela to come forward and threatened that if they didn't comply, they'd be questioned at their homes with their families present. At one point, it was suggested that Stephen Griffiths was responsible, since he was jailed for ending the lives of 3 street workers in 2009 and 2010, but no link between him and Michaela was ever found. 23 years after the attack, it was reported by the Star newspaper and Yorkshire police that someone had come forward with new information on Michaela's case, and that they may know the name of the man who ended her life. This information was received anonymously, but the authorities declined to state what the information was, since the case is still open and being actively investigated. It's hoped that with the advancement of forensic techniques and technology, evidence collected at the crime scene will one day lead to the perpetrator, but for the time being, anyone who can aid in Michaela's case is asked to contact Crime Stoppers at 0800-555-111. Number 7. The case involving the murders of 2 men, Brian Benson and Sean Campbell, started on the 10th of November 1993, and to this day, the police are still no closer to identifying the person responsible for ending their lives. At the time, both Sean and Brian were working part-time at the West Coast Video Store, which is located in Rosemore Shopping Center on Country Line Road in Warminster, Pennsylvania. They were fast friends who spent their childhood growing up together and were both 20 years old when the unthinkable happened. They were also both enrolled in college. The video store usually closed at 10 p.m. every night, and it's believed that the attacker knew this, since just before 10, they entered the store and sought out the 2 friends. What happened next wasn't discovered until the next morning, when the owner of the store arrived to open up for the day. He was surprised to find the store unlocked and immediately started searching the premises. To his horror, he came across the bodies of Sean and Brian in the adult section of the store. It was immediately apparent they were no longer alive, due to the large amount of biological material that was present on the floor around them. He called the police, and when the store was searched, it was discovered that $300 was missing from the cash register. But strangely, the attacker hadn't taken all of the cash, and when the 2 victims were checked, it was found they both still had their wallets on them, and that none of them had their money stolen. It's believed that the 2 men put up a brave fight, since a gold-studded earring was found on the floor, and it was suggested that it was ripped from the ear of the attacker during a struggle. Unfortunately, Sean and Brian lost the fight, and their lives were ended with a blade. Just a week later, a similar attack was carried out at another video store in New Jersey, and for a while it was suggested that the 2 cases might be linked, but the investigation into that case soon revealed that they were unrelated. The police announced a $53,000 reward, which was raised by the surrounding community and was on offer to anyone who supplied them with information leading to the culprit's apprehension, but no one came forward with any additional leads. Investigators have asked that anyone who can help progress this case contact the Warminster Police Department at 215-443-5000. Number 6. In August of 2015, 25-year-old Julie Mott was struggling with cystic fibrosis, a genetic disorder that affects the sufferer's internal organs, such as the lungs and pancreas. It's a condition that has no cure, though doctors are able to provide temporary relief in most cases. But for Julie, the fight to stay alive ended on the 8th of August that year, as she succumbed to the disorder. Her parents were left devastated, and the next day, her father agreed to pay $7,500 for her memorial service and cremation in San Antonio, Texas. The memorial was set to take place at Mission Park North at around noon. Sadly, it was held on her birthday, adding an extra sense of poignancy to the proceedings. It was expected that Julie's ex-boyfriend, Bill Wilburn, would attend, since he was said to still be obsessed with her despite the couple having broken up 2 years earlier. He did indeed show up, but strangely didn't leave with the rest of the mourners in attendance. He remained at the chapel for a further 15 minutes, and an employee from Mission Park would later state that he eventually had to ask Wilburn to leave. When he exited the building, the employee locked the door. The next step was to transfer the coffin containing Julie's remains to a different location for cremation, but this would not be done that day. In the meantime, the coffin was left in the hallway as Mission Park employees were leaving for the day, and they would later state that they locked all the doors and armed the security system. Everything had gone smoothly, and Julie's family could now rest easy in the knowledge that her cremation would be the next day. But that's when the case took a macabre turn. When employees returned to Mission Park the next day, they were shocked to find Julie's coffin empty. Someone had somehow managed to make it into the building without setting off the alarm, and her body was removed. The police were called, and it was discovered that the person who'd stolen the remains had broken one of the casket's hinges to gain entry. No signs of forced entry were found, and worryingly, the alarm had never sounded. The first person to be named as a suspect was Wilburn, and he was brought in for questioning. A $20,000 reward was offered for information leading to the culprit's capture, but no one came forward. Searches of the surrounding area proved fruitless, and Julie's family was left appalled and saddened by the fact that someone was troubled enough to steal her remains, something that most of us would consider unthinkable. It would later come to light that Mission Park had used the services of Bayer and Beitel, an embalming and transportation company, for years, and that they always had access to the building that Julie was kept in. Wilburn was sentenced to 2 days in jail when he was seen at the park after being forbidden from going there, and many people feel he was the culprit, but many others blame the employees of Bayer and Beitel. But Julie's remains have never been found, and her case remains under investigation. Number 5. For 17 years, the case concerning the murder of 5 people in Chicago has gone unsolved. But it's hoped that with the use of emerging technology, the culprit will finally be identified and made to face the consequences of his crime. The case unfolded on the 2nd of February 2008 when a man entered a Lane Bryant clothing store, which was located in Tinley Park. He was dressed as a delivery driver, but it would soon become apparent that this was merely a disguise. As soon as he entered the store, he ordered the 6 women who were inside the building into a back room, and there he bound them with tape. The owner of the store, Rhonda McFarland, would later call 911 and urge the police to rush to the store. But by the time they got there, 5 of the women had all lost their lives. The man had used a firearm to attack them, and one survived, but her name has not been made public. Rhonda passed away after placing the call, along with Jennifer Bishop, Sarah Zafransky, Connie Woolfolk, and Carrie Chuso. A profiler who was brought in by the police to aid in the investigation suggested that the man likely lived elsewhere, possibly in a city, and that he may have worked as a delivery driver in the past, since he used this as a way to get inside the store. She also thinks he was desperate for money and likely needed to support an illegal substance habit. Since he entered the store at around 10:30 a.m. in broad daylight, it's possible that this was his first robbery. The fact he hadn't covered his face further supports this theory. If he planned the robbery properly, he would have waited until the store had done more business before entering, since he would have made off with more cash. As a result, he fled the store with very little money and just a few pieces of jewelry. While this may have been his first robbery, investigators felt that he may have ended someone's life in the past, since a novice would find it hard to do this to one person, let alone 6, as he thought he had. The fact that he wore no face covering suggests that he never planned to let anyone inside that store live, and it's possible that he's affiliated with a gang. Before long, the case started to go cold, as no new leads were received, despite a $100,000 reward being offered. During the 911 call made by Rhonda, the attacker's voice could be heard saying, "You're lucky, I'm losing it," but it isn't known what he meant by that statement. The lone survivor aided the police in creating a sketch of the man, which was made available to the public, but it's failed to generate any new leads. In hopes that it'll bring renewed attention to the case, filmmaker Charlie Min has created a documentary on the events that unfolded that day, and he's called it a travesty that the case has gone unsolved as long as it has. Anyone who can help bring this case to a close is asked to contact the Tinley Park Police Department at 708-444-5394. Number 4. The case involving the murders of 88-year-old Russell Dermott and his wife, 87-year-old Shirley, is one that contains several disturbing details, including the fact that their attacker has never been identified. In May of 2014, the couple was living in Putnam County, where they'd purchased a house in a gated community in Lake Oconee. It was the perfect setting, the perfect place for the pair to spend the leisurely retirement years of their lives. But on the 3rd of May that year, their life together came to an abrupt and tragic end. According to the FBI, not all the details in this case have been made public, but they've now described it as a very unique case that continues to baffle investigators. It's known that Russell visited a Publix supermarket on the 21st of May, as is evidenced by surveillance footage from the store. It's believed that this was the last time that Russell was seen alive. As the afternoon of the 3rd of May took a sinister turn, Russell and Shirley had made plans to visit a neighbor on the 3rd to watch the Kentucky Derby, but they failed to arrive. The neighbor tried phoning but got no answer, and so went to check on them at the house. What he found there left him in a state of shock. When he found the front door locked, he decided to check the garage, and there he came across Russell's body. Disturbingly, his head was missing. He immediately contacted the police, who raced to the scene, but things were about to get even worse. They made it into the house, and it was searched, but Shirley was nowhere to be seen. They also failed to locate Russell's head, and a search of the surrounding area also proved fruitless. Almost 2 weeks later, a fisherman contacted the police to report that he'd come across a woman's remains in the lake about 5 miles from the house. When the remains were retrieved, they were confirmed to belong to Shirley, and it was discovered that she'd been tied down with cinder blocks to keep her body from floating to the surface. Investigators were at a loss as to why Russell was left at the house to be discovered while Shirley was taken to the lake. Furthermore, there seemed to be no reason for his head to have been taken. It was later determined that Shirley had lost her life due to assault. While precious little evidence was found at the crime scene, investigators suggested that this was a targeted attack. Nothing had been stolen from the house, and many people believed that the couple might have known the assailant. DNA evidence was collected at the scene, and hopefully this will bring the culprit to justice in the future. It's been revealed that some DNA that was found on Russell's shirt belonged to an unknown person, but no match has been found so far. A $25,000 reward is on offer for information leading to an arrest. The FBI's Atlanta field office has asked that anyone with information contact them at 770-216-3000. Number 3. In June of 2001, 41-year-old Eric Tamiyasu was living in a remote area of Hood River, Oregon, a quiet town that would soon be rocked by his sudden passing. At the time, he and a close friend, Diana Anderson, had decided to start dating. She would later recall that while she was visiting him at his house one night, they became aware of a strange tapping noise coming from outside. When Eric investigated, he found that the noise was coming from the front door, but as he approached, the couple heard the sound of someone fleeing. When they looked through a window to see who it was, the person had already run out of their view. The incident left Diana feeling very uneasy, since she still had to travel home alone that night. A few days later, some of Eric's friends started contacting Don Dixon, another of his friends, and asked whether he had seen him. They stated that they'd been trying to contact him for several days but got no answer. A week after Russell and Diana had been spooked by the strange noises at the house, Don decided to go by the house to check on him, but Russell didn't answer the door. He then decided to use his key, which had been given to him by Russell, to enter the back door. As soon as the door opened, he knew something was wrong, as he became aware of an overwhelming odor. He suspected that his worst fears may have come true, and so he searched the house. In the main bedroom, he found Russell lying deceased on his bed. He knew that Russell was no longer alive, and so he called the police. When officers arrived, they suspected that Eric had suffered a medical episode such as a heart attack, and his body was taken to a coroner. That's when the case took an unexpected turn. The coroner found that Eric's life had been ended with a firearm, which was unexpected since there were no signs of trauma on the rest of his body. Before this was discovered, though, Dawn removed Eric's bedding and burned it in a burn pile in the garden at the police's request. They believed this would save his family the grief of removing the bedding on which he was found. Unfortunately, this may have resulted in valuable evidence being lost. People started suggesting that Eric and the wife of the town's sheriff, Joe Wampler, were having an affair, since both she and the woman whom Eric had been seeing were older than him and Polynesian. Wampler has, however, denied having the evidence destroyed on purpose and has trashed claims of the affair. It would then come to light that Eric Smith, Eric's business partner, was accused of stealing money from their used car company, and that Eric demanded that he repay between $50,000 and $60,000. Dawn heard the two men arguing one day and reported this to the police. Smith has denied that they had an argument and has stated that he never stole or owed Eric any money. He claims that Dawn has fabricated the entire story for reasons unknown. Investigators have stated that the case will remain open and that any new leads will be followed up on, but for now, the case remains unsolved. Number 2. At the time of her disappearance in 2013, 20-year-old Heather Elvis was working as a hostess at the Tilted Kilt restaurant in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. But she didn't have the best reputation among people living in the area. She and 37-year-old Sydney Moorer, a maintenance worker who often stopped in at the restaurant, had started a relationship despite the fact that he was a married man with 3 children. This wasn't the first time that Moorer had been unfaithful to his wife, Tammy. She'd grown ever more suspicious of him in the weeks leading up to Heather's disappearance, and by all accounts was the domineering partner in their relationship. Strangely, Heather and Moorer did very little to keep their relationship secret, and most people who visited the restaurant, or who knew either of them, were aware of the affair. Heather had been called names by other women and was even the butt of a few pranks, such as when 2 of her co-workers called the restaurant and demanded to speak to Heather while pretending to be Tammy. As a result of the earlier affair, Moorer had become exceptionally submissive to his wife, who told him how to dress, where to work, and where he was allowed to go. In October of 2013, Tammy really did phone the restaurant, and she confronted Heather. This brought the affair to an abrupt end. According to witnesses, Tammy was extremely abusive towards Heather during the call, and made it seem as though she meant very little to Moorer. Following this, Tammy started harassing Heather, and would continually contact her while slandering her on social media accounts. She started texting Heather photos of her and Moorer together, called her incessantly, and continued to taunt her relentlessly. According to those close to Heather, she'd started living in fear of Tammy, but by December of that year, things started to return to normal as Tammy's harassment started to abate. Heather moved on, and the Moorers went on a trip to California to try and save their marriage. They left Myrtle Beach in their Ford F-250, which was a new purchase. Then, on the 19th of December that year, Heather's family would receive some worrying news. Her car, a Dodge Intrepid, was reported to the police as it had been parked about 8 miles away for hours, and multiple people in the area found it suspicious that it had been left unattended for that long. When the police responded, they found that the car was parked at the Peachtree Boat Landing, which is used by fishermen to launch their boats into the water. The car contained none of Heather's belongings, and it was in good condition. Her family started to worry when she could not be located, and they frantically tried to get in touch with her, but without success. Heather had gone missing for the first time in her life, and they feared the worst. It was discovered that she and a man named Steve Schiraldi had gone on a date the previous evening, and when he was questioned, he stated he dropped her off at home after the date was over. On the 20th of December, investigators questioned Moorer, but he stated that they hadn't spoken for quite a while, and that he had no intention of seeing her. Heather's phone records showed that she'd made and received calls to and from a phone booth at 1:35 a.m. on the morning of her disappearance. She had called the number 9 times, and it's assumed that someone had called her from that number, spoke to Heather, and then hung up. She then likely tried to get back in touch with them, but didn't realize that they'd called from a public phone, and had likely already left the area. Moorer would later admit to making the call, but stated he'd only contacted Heather to ask her to leave him alone. This was contradicted by one of Heather's friends, who spoke to her that morning. Heather stated that Moorer told her that he had left Tammy and that he wanted to be with her again. A Ford Intrepid, the same model as Moorer's, was then seen on surveillance footage near Peachtree Landing, and minutes later, Heather's phone was turned off. The Moorers were arrested, and they were charged with kidnapping, and they were each sentenced to 2 30-year stints in prison, and Heather's remains have never been located. Number 1. On the 17th of June, 2008, the fire department in Kearney, Nebraska, responded to reports that a mobile home was on fire at R Villa South Trailer Court. When the flames were eventually doused, the structure was searched, and a gruesome discovery was made. Among the ashes, they discovered the remains of 21-year-old Kelsey Fike, who was living in the trailer at the time. An autopsy would later reveal that Kelsey's life had been ended before the fire broke out, but any evidence that was present had gone up in flames, along with the trailer. At the time, she was living in the trailer with her boyfriend, but he was immediately ruled out as a suspect since he was visiting another state when the fire broke out. When those who knew Kelsey were interviewed, it was discovered that she'd finished her shift at Bob's Superstore the previous day and left at around 5:30 p.m. She was seen outside the trailer by her neighbors at around 9 p.m., and they added that she was with her beloved dog, Dante. It's known that she messaged her boyfriend at 1 a.m. on the day of the fire, and that this was the last communication anyone had with Kelsey. When surveillance footage from the area was checked, it was discovered that a dark-colored sedan had left the park and then headed east on 24th Street. Unfortunately, due to the poor quality of the footage, neither the car nor its driver could be identified. Kelsey was found deceased between the trailer's bedroom and hallway, dressed in just a t-shirt. The resulting investigation confirmed that the fire had been set intentionally, since the fire was found to have started in a laundry basket in Kelsey's bedroom. The wall above the basket showed that the fire had spread in a V shape, and it's believed that no accelerant was used, since the trailer would have likely been completely destroyed if this were the case. It's been suggested that Kelsey knew her attacker, who ended her life via assault and strangulation, since she was a very cautious person who always kept her doors locked. But when the fire department arrived, they found both doors unlocked. Furthermore, her dog was known to bark at strangers, but no one had heard him bark that morning. Thus, it's assumed that Kelsey let her attacker in and that she trusted whoever ended her life. In the 17 years that have since passed, no suspects have been identified, but it's hoped that DNA evidence, which was collected from the trailer, will one day bring them to justice. For now, though, Kelsey's case remains an unsolved mystery.